I never thought a single secret could turn my whole world inside out, but that's exactly what happened, and when the truth finally came, I had two choices: crumble or become the person who dealt the consequences. If you're new here, please hit subscribe. Comment below where you're watching from. My name is Amara. I'm 26 years old. My family owned the kind of house people put in magazines: stone columns, a wraparound porch, gardens that smelled of rosemary and lemon. My father, Thomas Lane, ran a small chain of property developments. My mother, Elaine, taught piano and hosted charity luncheons with effortless grace. I had a younger brother, Marcus, whom everyone assumed would inherit the business. We looked solid, as if the world could point at us and say, "There, stability." Appearances are dangerous when your life depends on them. It began the summer my father fell ill. He'd been coughing for weeks, but we said it was stress or allergies or something minor. When he finally went into the hospital, the doctors warned us that time might not be on our side. The weeks that followed blurred into machines, doctors' faces, and phone calls from clients who suddenly seemed more interested in contracts than condolences. I spent nights at his bedside, holding his hand while he whispered apologies for things I didn't yet understand. When he passed, the funeral was crowded and polite, full of people who shed exactly the right number of tears. A week later we gathered in the lawyer's office where I had watched my father sign documents when I was a child. The will reading should have been a small closure. Marcus would take over, Mom would keep the house, I would get my portion and move on. But the lawyer read words that felt like a blow. The company was left to a trust, controlled by a board that included a name none of us recognized. The properties had liquidation clauses in the event of mismanagement. And for me, my father left a single handwritten line: "Amara, find out the truth. Trust no one. Trust no one." I stared at my mother, searching for some admission. She blinked, the way people do when a language sounds foreign. Marcus looked stunned for a beat, and then folded his expression into resolve. The lawyer closed the folder with a soft click, and the air smelled like old paper and the loss of illusions. That note woke something in me. Not merely the sting of being excluded from the company, but the idea that my father had known something we did not. He was the kind of man who kept his hands clean. If he had left me that breadcrumb, he'd been trying to point me somewhere. I promised myself I would find out what he meant. I started in the office. I dug through files Dad had kept where he kept correspondence: business proposals, press releases, glossy plans for new developments. It took weeks, but patterns began to appear. Clusters of emails with a private contractor, transfers labeled as consulting fees routed through small shell companies, and repeated references to a property in a neighboring county that wasn't on any public register. When I followed the paper trail, it led me to a name I recognized: my mother's maiden name, and then to invoices implicating Marcus. My hands shook as I read the numbers. Marcus, the steady son everyone trusted, had been moving money. Not small sums. Significant transfers routed through intermediaries. And in a folder marked "Personal, Elaine," I found a photograph that hit me harder than any spreadsheet. It was my mother with another man, standing on a plot of undeveloped land that later became one of Dad's most profitable projects. The photograph was dated the year I was born. Everything snapped into place like brittle bone. My father's trust had been compromised for years, quietly siphoned through deals that looked legitimate on paper. Marcus had been complicit. My mother had been protecting him, protecting herself, and my father had known. That explained the small coldness I had always felt, the way our family looked whole from the outside while some seems frayed inside. My father's note was a compass he left me when he could no longer navigate. Betrayal has a sound very different from surprise. It is quiet, like a settling glass. I felt its weight and, for a long while, considered exposing them publicly, yelling it all into the echo chamber. Rage is loud and easy, effective like a panic alarm. But anger without strategy is clumsy. If I wanted consequences that fit the crime, I had to be surgical. I would not simply shout. I would dismantle the scaffolding that made their pretenses possible. I made a plan on the back of an old receipt. Small steps, patient and precise. First, gather factual evidence and secure it where no one could touch it. Second, find allies. An accountant who spoke human, not ledger, a journalist unafraid of local power. Third, orchestrate a reveal in a setting where investors and press would be present, the annual shareholders' meeting. I am not a hacker. I am not a criminal mastermind. What I had was proximity, and that matters. Marcus had taught me where Dad kept sensitive notes, which contractors were never questioned, and how the files were organized by year. Using that knowledge, I copied documents to a secure drive and backed them up across 2 cloud accounts he would never think to check. I printed copies and hid them in a safety deposit box under a different name. I spoke quietly with an accountant I'd known years ago, blunt, a little bitter and hungry for truth. He read the files and told me in plain language where the irregularities would hurt most. Next came the journalist. Priya covered local politics and had a reputation for not being dazzled by titles. I sent a single sealed email. Meet me Friday at noon by the courthouse. She arrived with a notebook and a face that said she'd been waiting for a story like mine. I handed her the documents. She skimmed, then looked up, voice low. This will burn them. Are you ready? I said I was. Timing matters. The shareholders' meeting was a stage. Investors, press, and local officials would be there with smiles and checkbooks. I bought a ticket and took a seat in the second row. That morning Marcus gave a polished speech about legacy and stewardship while my mother sat to his right, composed and flawless. The room applauded him. I felt a sickness at the way applause could sanctify what was rotten. I excused myself to the restroom during the slideshow, a move that let me slip away unseen. Priya texted, "We're live." I walked back in, fingers steady, and approached the stage during the Q&A. The chairman hesitated. "Family matters," he said politely. "I have information that concerns the shareholders," I told him. They looked at me like I was a child spoiling a party, but then the journalist insisted, and the chairman handed me the microphone. I read plainly, naming accounts, dates, and shell companies. Phones came out. People flipped through the copies Priya had distributed. Cameras clicked. Marcus went white. Investors whispered. By the end of the day, the regulators were looped in, and the local news anchors were rehearsing their grim faces. Marcus left the building like a man naked in public. No dignity, only the flapping remnants of a life unstitched. My mother refused to meet my eyes. Her mouth was a thin line. But amid the initial triumph came consequences I had not fully measured. Rows of employees who had been loyal to the company now feared for their livelihoods. Elderly investors panicked. Contractors who'd lent money on faith scrambled to protect themselves. The reality of what I'd set in motion lodged in my chest like a cold stone. Then Sophie, my youngest sister, gentle and loyal, arrived at my door one morning with a cedar chest. She shook as she handed me a stack of letters our father had written but never mailed. In those pages he confessed his regret and his fear about tearing the family apart. He'd been trying, imperfectly, to protect the people he loved without destroying what he built. He had been terrified of the fallout and had chosen silence at times. He had also left me a breadcrumb trail, the only way he could say in the end, "Trust no one." Reading those letters softened the edges of my anger. My father had not been flawless. He had made compromises out of fear and love. The letters rewired my understanding of what justice meant. It could not only be punishment, it must include repair. So I did what I had almost ignored. I met with employees whose paychecks had bounced, with contractors left unpaid, with small investors who had lost trust. I apologized. Not for exposing truth, but for the pain my choice had unleashed on innocent people. With the guidance of legal counsel, we set up a restitution fund seeded by remaining family assets. It was small and slow work. Phone calls, paperwork, handshakes, and sometimes a silent cup of coffee in a little cafe where we tried to untangle the human cost of what had happened. Months passed. Marcus faced charges, and the company was restructured under court supervision. My mother retreated from public life. Sophie moved in with me for a while so we could sift through Dad's papers and decide whether family was a thing we could rebuild. There were shouting matches, nights of silence, and mornings where we read Dad's words aloud until they transformed from accusation into memory. I am not proud of every choice I made. Revenge changed me, sharpened me into someone less naive, less trusting. But it also forced me to become someone who carried responsibility. The restitution program we set up now helps families hit by corporate collapses and pays for retraining programs for displaced workers. It is not glamorous. It is slow and necessary. It gave my anger a shape that could do more than burn. There is no tidy moral here. Secrets cut deep, and revenge can feel sweet and hollow at once. What I learned is this: you can expose corruption and still have to pick up the pieces afterwards. Power without conscience corrodes, but vengeance without repair becomes its own cruelty. So tell me briefly, would you have exposed your family knowing the fallout might hurt innocent people, or would you have walked away and carried the truth alone?